Imagine the scene. A deceptively bright Saturday morning in November, 1988. A pair of 9-year-old girls glide down a tranquil California road on scooters, sharing innocent laughter over an upcoming theatrical performance. Their destination is a beloved local market a mere 4 streets away to purchase sweets. In precisely 17 minutes, one child will vanish without a trace. The predator destined to steal her away is already in position, silently observing. His snare is laid out. Before we descend into this chilling narrative, take a breath. Please take a moment to endorse this presentation and follow our ongoing work. We delve into authentic criminal investigations weekly, and your continued viewership fuels these deep dives. Let us untangle the grim events of November 19th, 1988, a fateful afternoon that shattered a household and sparked one of the most agonizingly complex manhunts in California history. The 19th of November, 1988, Hayward, California. For the Garechts, that weekend, dawn broke with deceptive normalcy. Sharon Garecht lingered by the kitchen window, scrubbing morning plates, as her spouse, Rod, tinkered with their vehicle out in the driveway. Their 9-year-old girl, Michaela, darted playfully between her own front yard and the residence of her closest confidante, Katrina Rodriguez. Katrina resided directly opposite them, and the duo was busy testing outfits for an upcoming performance. Bringing Michaela into existence had cost her parents 5 agonizing years. Half a decade of medical procedures and desperate hopes preceded her eventual birth on the 24th of January, 1979. She was hailed as their wondrous little triumph. Following Michaela's arrival, the family welcomed a younger daughter, Libby, alongside a son, Alex. The parents had relocated to this idyllic Hayward community, specifically seeking a sanctuary of absolute safety. It boasted shaded avenues and warm acquaintances, a pristine environment where youth could carelessly pedal to the local shop. Yet, Sharon possessed an underlying anxiety uncommon among her peers. She remained fiercely vigilant. This hyper-awareness stemmed from a grim reality plaguing 1988 California, an insidious epidemic of vanishing youth. Dairy containers statewide bore the haunting portraits of abducted youngsters. Nightly broadcasts relentlessly detailed terrifying accounts of minors being snatched from recreational parks, shopping centers, and even the sanctuary of their own doorsteps. Sharon obsessively consumed these grim dispatches each evening, responding by gripping her offspring ever closer. Her nocturnal routine involved repeatedly verifying their presence before attempting sleep. Often she would jolt awake in the dead of darkness, compelled to visually confirm her children lay safely tucked beneath their sheets. A paralyzing dread of child loss entirely dictated her psyche, particularly regarding Michaela, the precious infant she had spent half a decade desperately trying to conceive. Consequently, when Katrina appeared on their porch that weekend morning, clutching currency gifted by her dad and requesting Michaela's company for a sweet run, Sharon's response was an instantaneous denial. Absolutely not. However, Michaela relentlessly pleaded, assuring her mother of their absolute caution and swift return. They promised an immediate journey home. Sharon paused, intensely studying the brightly optimistic expression staring back at her. The establishment sat a mere 4 intersections distant. The girls had navigated this exact route countless times before. It was broad daylight. What sinister force could realistically intervene? She relented. That singular affirmation became a lifelong psychological torment. Passing a $5 bill to Michaela, Sharon fixed both youngsters with a profoundly stern maternal glare. Do not separate. Proceed directly to the shop. Return without delay. Michaela eagerly seized her 2-wheeled ride. Katrina laid claim to the push scooter owned by Michaela's sibling. In the fleeting seconds before kicking off the pavement, Michaela glanced over her shoulder one final time. A cheerful declaration of affection echoed back before she vanished down the asphalt, her golden hair catching the bright morning rays. Giggles faded into the distance. Sharon returned her focus to the soapy water, while Rod continued his automotive repairs. The clock struck 10 on an early day of the holiday recess. The atmosphere breathed ordinary domesticity. Yet, complete devastation loomed mere moments away. The Rainbow Market anchored itself along Mission Boulevard, positioned under a kilometer from their doorstep. To the young pair, this excursion lacked any sense of thrill. It was simply a familiar, daily ritual. Daily treks for sugary treats and carbonated beverages were an established habit. Abandoning their rides near the glass storefront per usual, the girls stepped into the aisles. They gathered their coveted snacks, a pair of citrus sodas, dual packs of dried meat, and twin cherry-flavored sweets, settled the tab, and exited into the daylight. Deep in animated conversation, they buzzed with anticipation over the festive season, theatrical garbs, and the trivial wonders that captivate elementary-aged minds on a brilliant weekend. Caught in their own little world, their transportation was entirely forgotten. They had already commenced the pedestrian trek back when a sudden realization struck Michaela. A panicked halt, they had abandoned their wheels. The children hastily retraced their steps toward the asphalt lot. It was then that a subtle, chilling anomaly revealed itself. Michaela's ride was gone, not pilfered, but meticulously relocated, propped against a stranger's vehicle 3 parking stalls distant. This relocation defied mere coincidence. It was no opportunistic prank. It was a calculated, lethal ambush waiting to be sprung. Spotting the object, Katrina gestured toward it. Unsuspecting, Michaela approached to retrieve her property, lowering her small frame to grasp the metal grips. In a fraction of a heartbeat, a shadowy figure erupted from the adjacent sedan, securing a violent hold around her midsection and launching her forcefully into the rear cabin. Katrina stood utterly paralyzed. Her mind failed to process the unfolding nightmare. Heavy doors slammed shut, followed by a violently roaring engine. The automobile peeled out of the paved lot, dissolving into the traffic of Mission Boulevard. Michaela Garecht had vanished. For an agonizing 5 seconds, her companion remained utterly motionless. Pure psychological trauma operates exactly like this, anchoring your limbs to the earth while your internal reality shatters. Then, a sudden surge of survival instinct broke the spell. Sprinting frantically back through the convenience store doors, she unleashed a terrified scream. A stranger had stolen Michaela, violently snatching her before speeding off into the unknown. The clerk on duty, Rona Rowland, wasted no time dialing 911, and within mere moments, a tidal wave of patrol vehicles descended upon the asphalt. Uniformed responders locked down the perimeter, interrogating bystanders and hunting for forensic traces, while Rona hastily contacted the father of young Katrina. He bolted to the market, precipitating the agonizing task of delivering a message that shatters a family. While back at their residence, Sharon remained blissfully unaware, washing dishes. Her husband, Rod, lingered outdoors, both utterly oblivious to the chilling reality that their little girl had already vanished into the ether a full 20 minutes prior. Frantic yells pierced the neighborhood quiet, though Rod initially failed to register the panic until Katrina's father materialized, his visage painted with sheer, unmistakable devastation. It was the haunting gaze of total catastrophe, signaling the unthinkable. Michaela had been snatched, dragged off by a phantom predator right outside the local convenience shop. Tearing violently through the front entrance, Rod screamed his wife's name, causing the ceramic plate in her hands to slip and shatter against the cold linoleum. He ordered her to guard the landline, agonizingly anticipating a potential extortion demand, before he sprinted desperately toward the epicenter of the crime. What Rod encountered upon arrival was a landscape of absolute pandemonium, suffocated by a sea of flashing lights and swarming law enforcement. Crime scene barriers cordoned off investigators crawling over the concrete, while a traumatized Katrina trembled nearby in mute sobs, leaving Rod to furiously repeat a single agonizing inquiry. Demanding the whereabouts of his little girl, his pleas met only grim silence. Michaela was already out of reach, and the mysterious vehicle had melted away into the daylight. Each agonizingly ticking moment allowed the abductor to put more miles between them. While miles away, Sharon remained utterly paralyzed beside the landline receiver. The prevailing investigative theory immediately pointed to financial extortion. Snatching a 9-year-old under the glaring midday sun typically implies a calculated, lucrative motive. They braced for a transactional exchange of cash for life, desperately awaiting the inevitable negotiation to end the nightmare, but that communication never materialized. The deafening silence stretched from hours into eternity, revealing that extortion wasn't the goal. A far more sinister reality loomed, presenting detectives with a massive operational hurdle. Digital eyes were completely absent. No lenses monitored the exterior, the parking spaces, or the adjacent avenues, a bleak reality of the year 1988. The ubiquitous surveillance networks of the modern age were merely a distant dream, leaving modest neighborhood retailers completely blind to criminal activity. Consequently, the entire investigation hinged on a traumatized child and random bystanders, with the clerk offering the initial, crucial physical profile of the predator. She had observed a highly sketchy figure loitering just prior to the abduction. He had exited his vehicle but tellingly refused to cross the establishment's threshold. He simply lingered, staring intently through the glass and analyzing pedestrians with an unsettling, predatory intensity that she found deeply disturbing. Fearing an impending holdup, she noted a Caucasian male near his third decade with a prominent mustache, operating an aging, deep crimson automobile. The vehicle's shade was akin to dried blood, though the specific model and registration eluded her, prompting authorities to hastily draft a suspect drawing. Before the sun even set, the menacing rendering flooded regional precincts, dominated television bulletins, and was splashed across countless local front pages. The tragedy quickly monopolized Northern California media, prompting swarms of cops to pull over any vintage crimson sedan, praying to uncover a frightened child hidden within. They were effectively pursuing a phantom in the wind. Simultaneously, technicians analyzed the victim's abandoned ride, developing a horrifying hypothesis. The predator had strategically repositioned it near his vehicle as bait to ensnare her. Forensics naturally expected to find dermal ridges left behind on the metal, a dark suspicion that the laboratory specialist quickly validated. A distinct smudge tainted the steering grip, a biological impression entirely alien to the victim, her traumatized companion, or their respective relatives. This trace belonged unmistakably to the monster, standing as the paramount clue, yet a heartbreaking flaw remained. The marking was severely fractured and degraded. Merely a tenth of the patterned skin survived, and given the primitive forensic tools of 1988, that fractional trace offered absolutely zero actionable intelligence. Automated archives couldn't process such a sliver. It was strictly valid for one-to-one matching, requiring law enforcement to actually detain a primary suspect beforehand. Thus, the most vital clue was entombed in a cardboard archive, left to gather dust in grim silence for an agonizing 32 years. As detectives rigorously scoured the asphalt, a suffocating, paralyzing wave of maternal remorse entirely consumed Sharon back at their quiet house. Her mind obsessively looped the dawn's events, the innocent request to go out, her own fleeting reluctance, tragically yielding to the plea, and the final spoken phrase. That final declaration of affection amplified the agonizing regret of not forbidding the trip, of lacking strictness, and of fatally ignoring her own protective instincts. Suddenly, a buried memory violently resurfaced, plunging her veins into absolute, undeniable frost. Exactly 7 sunrises prior to the snatching, the mother had discovered her child intensely scribbling in the pre-dawn shadows, a highly unusual and unsettling occurrence. The girl, notorious for sleeping late, was inexplicably awake. When questioned, a groggy Michaela murmured that she was simply drafting poetry. Pried for details, the child hesitated to reveal the dark subject matter, refusing to yield until sheer maternal persistence finally wore her down. She claimed phantom ceiling noises had disturbed her slumber, invoking macabre thoughts of victims violently stolen and confined in dark, hidden spaces. She was documenting their plight, which washed an eerie dread over Sharon, especially when the girl grimly specified she meant living captives, not the deceased. Individuals who were violently abducted and preserved, imprisoned in some undisclosed nightmarish location for an absolute eternity. Though deeply unsettled at the time, the mother had forcefully dismissed the grim verses as mere juvenile fantasy grappling with common, irrational anxieties. Now guarding the silent receiver for an update on her vanished girl, those verses reeked of dark prophecy. Had her child somehow perceived a looming, inescapable evil? Could it have been genuine foresight, a supernatural peek at her own impending doom? That agonizing, unanswerable mystery would ruthlessly haunt the mother straight to her grave. As twilight descended, federal agents took over. Hayward and its neighboring districts were already bleeding from a terrifying surge of vanished youth. Bureau profilers theorized a habitual hunter was actively prowling the Bay Area. Even with federal resources, relentless broadcasts, and an avalanche of leads, progress stalled completely. Then, detectives uncovered their own devastating error. 48 hours had been squandered chasing a phantom. A 30-something mustachioed male fleeing in a crimson automobile. Derived entirely from a clerk's flawed memory, this became the official composite driving an army of officers on a futile manhunt. Law enforcement entirely bypassed Katrina, the sole direct observer who had actually locked eyes with the abductor. She had stared directly into the predator's soul right before he vanished with her closest companion. Paralyzed by shock initially, the young witness remained virtually mute. Authorities took merely a superficial report, bypassing a comprehensive interrogation, while 48 hours slipped away. The crimson vehicle and mustachioed phantom never materialized. Eventually, detectives visited the traumatized girl's residence to conduct a thorough interrogation. Her revelations completely shattered the current theory, exposing that authorities had just squandered the absolute most vital 48-hour window of the hunt. An agonizing 48 hours had evaporated since Michaela vanished. 2 irreplaceable days were gone, and authorities were on the verge of realizing they had been pursuing a mere ghost. The moment investigators finally conducted an exhaustive sit-down with Katrina Rodriguez, her chilling account dismantled their entire working theory. The predator wasn't a 30-year-old man. He was a bare-faced youth, barely out of his teens. He possessed shoulder-length, greasy blonde locks, and his complexion was ravaged by deep, unmistakable cratering. Then came the gaze, an unforgettable, piercing feature. She detailed a glacial, unnatural blue. They were feral, predatory, reminiscent of a fox. He glared directly through her, looking completely detached and vacant. Furthermore, his getaway vehicle was actually a battered, squared-off beige sedan, not crimson at all. A sickening wave of dread washed over the investigators. Every single assumption was fundamentally flawed. The distributed facial composite, the automobile details, and the psychological dossier dispatched across California were completely useless. As law enforcement pursued a fictitious suspect in a maroon vehicle, the actual predator was escaping in a tan clunker, trapping a horrified 9-year-old in the rear. Each moment squandered on a false lead allowed the perpetrator to drag his victim further into the abyss, drawing her nearer to an unimaginable horror. A revised suspect sketch was urgently commissioned. A scarred youth in his early 20s with stringy hair and feral piercing irises. However, the catastrophic delay was irreversible. That critical initial 48-hour window, the absolute best time frame for a living recovery, had been irrevocably shattered. Authorities were forced back to square one. A civilian army immediately swarmed the thoroughfares of Hayward. Searching households and canvassing locals, the community rapidly blanketed the region with 42,000 detailed bulletins featuring the missing child's portrait and outfit, a pale metro top, cuffed denim, dark Mary Jane footwear, and distinctive pearl-accented feather jewelry. Detectives aggressively interrogated local registered offenders, verifying whereabouts and hunting for any individual resembling the updated profile. Leads cascaded into the precinct 4,000 during the initial 10 months, demanding exhaustive verification. Every single trail went cold. Suddenly, civilians exploring a nearby nature reserve stumbled upon a chilling clue: dual sets of tracks, a grown man and a small child. Tracking these impressions deep into the timberland, they unearthed abandoned bedding strewn among fast food debris. First responders descended rapidly. Federal behavioral experts theorized that a captor preserving his victim would definitely select an isolated stronghold. This desolate reserve matched the psychological profile seamlessly, triggering an enormous mobilization. Ground units and aerial infrared technology pierced the dense canopy. As daylight bled into endless nights, the wilderness yielded absolutely nothing, neither captive nor captor. Operations widened to encompass surrounding ranges, deep woodlands, and uncharted terrain. Yet the void remained. The young girl had dissolved into the ether, her abductor proving equally ghostly. Meanwhile, the investigation erupted onto the national stage. Unsolved Mysteries broadcast the terrifying details, marking one of their earliest deep dives into stolen youth. More than 1 million dairy cartons across the state bore her haunting portrait. National advocacy groups distributed 50 million mailers featuring her face alongside the predator's drawing, pulling in high-profile attention. Legendary 49ers athlete Joe Montana broadcasted desperate pleas for leads, backed by a staggering $70,000 bounty. Yet, even with nationwide scrutiny, massive financial incentives, civilian armies, and federal backing, the detectives hit a brick wall. Entering December, 6 weeks post-abduction, authorities faced the cameras to confess a chilling reality. The trail was completely dead. They had scrutinized endless clues, interrogated legions of persons of interest, and scoured infinite grids. Progress remained as stagnant as the day she was taken. Seasons faded into years as law enforcement tirelessly pursued an unrelenting stream of dead-end clues. Driven by desperation, Sharon launched a solitary crusade, analyzing national abductions for hidden connections, while the community clung to a fading hope for her return. She never returned. By 1991, agonizing years after the initial abduction, detectives pivoted their attention toward a fresh and alarming person of interest, a 43-year-old named Timothy Binder. As investigators peeled back the layers of his life, a profoundly unsettling psychological portrait began to emerge. Binder possessed a chilling habit of mailing unsolicited cash and presents to little girls he had never even met. Horrified parents flagged the behavior, though, under interrogation, he brushed it off as mere neighborly affection. The reality was far darker. Hidden within those care packages were scriptures, featuring deeply menacing passages deliberately highlighted in ink. Phrases like, "I handpicked you," "Come belong to me." Digging into his past, authorities unearthed a 1985 termination from a Colorado social services agency. His offense? Secretly harvesting the home addresses of juvenile female clients to mail them unauthorized parcels. A subsequent raid on his vehicle revealed a rolling nightmare. The interior was plastered with candid photographs of youths, erratic scriptural verses taped to the paneling, and scattered crayon sketches. This pale blue cruiser sported a sickeningly brazen custom license plate that read, "Love you." Worse, he already had a history of detentions for attempting to coax minors inside. Yet, by some failure of the system, those predatory charges evaporated, leaving him with a lone public intoxication conviction. But his true menace lay in a far more insidious psychological compulsion. He possessed a morbid obsession with injecting himself directly into active abduction investigations. A mere 6 months prior to Michaela's vanishing, another local 7-year-old, Amber, had gone missing. Binder practically camped on the grieving mother's doorstep, masquerading as a benevolent savior while weaving himself intimately into their daily trauma. He went so far as to draft a sinister letter to law enforcement, foretelling that the next target would be exactly 9. Shortly after, 9-year-old Michaela evaporated into thin air. The moment the manhunt for Michaela kicked off, Binder repeated his grotesque ritual. He bombarded her mother, Sharon, with incessant phone calls and uninvited home visits, cloaked in false altruism. By December 1988, his taunts escalated. He mailed a federal behavioral analyst a holiday greeting card depicting a young female child deliberately holding up 4 digits. Merely weeks following that postal delivery, 4-year-old Amanda Campbell was snatched from Fairfield. Detectives also found circumstantial ties connecting him to the vanishing of a 13-year-old named Eileen in nearby Dublin. The geography of grief painted a glaring picture. This lone individual lingered like a shadow over a cluster of vanished minors throughout the Bay Area. Armed with a search warrant, task force members descended upon his residence, dismantling the property in a desperate hunt for a smoking gun. They unearthed absolutely nothing. There was zero forensic material anchoring him to the atrocities. However, once his name bled into the press, mass hysteria ignited, with terrified citizens unilaterally convicting him of every unsolved local abduction. The resulting vigilante backlash made his existence intolerable, barraging him with relentless death threats and vicious harassment. In retaliation, Binder filed a massive defamation lawsuit against the municipality of Fairfield. Staggeringly, the court ruled in his favor, forcing detectives to retreat. The consensus shifted. He was likely just an obsessive, inserting himself into tragedies to feed a grandiose, deeply unsettling narcissism. Yet, a lingering doubt remained. Regardless, the official inquiry pivoted elsewhere, and another 4 agonizing years slipped into the void. By the bitter chill of December 1992, Michaela's fate remained completely shrouded in darkness. Suddenly, a shockwave arrived from an Indiana penitentiary. Roger Haggard, a convict doing an 11-year stint for breaking and entering, reached out with explosive allegations. He knew the kidnapper's identity and had personally concealed the evidence. He swore he could pinpoint the child's exact burial site. Naturally, seasoned detectives doubted the tale, prompting the desperate inmate to bypass them entirely and pen a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle. The moment the publication ran the sensational scoop, a firestorm of public outrage erupted, placing catastrophic political pressure squarely on the shoulders of local law enforcement. Forced to act, authorities arranged an interstate transport, dragging Haggard from the Midwest to the West Coast for grueling, intensive interrogations. Behind closed doors, he doubled down on his guarantees, pledging to reveal both the girl's hidden grave and the precise monster responsible for her slaughter. Escorted to a desolate stretch of gladiolas in Union City, eerily close to ground zero of the abduction tactical excavation teams broke ground promptly at 8 a.m. Heavy machinery and specialized forensic crews meticulously sifted through the dirt, praying to finally hand the shattered Garecht family some semblance of peace. Agonizing hours dragged on as shovels struck earth. Out of nowhere, Hayward shattered the tense silence. It was a complete fabrication. The task force froze in disbelief as he confessed, "Every word was a lie. There is no body beneath us." When furiously pressed for a motive, his justification defied basic human logic. He claimed he merely fabricated the closure to soothe the grieving family's pain and grant them psychological release. In reality, he had weaponized their vulnerability, gifting them an illusion of finality only to violently snatch it back. The relatives were psychologically ruined, while the betrayal left investigators absolutely enraged. The entire region reeled from the cruel deception. The justice system retaliated brutally, tacking a combined 18 years onto Hayward's sentence and ordering him to pay $6,000 for the family's severe emotional trauma. It was merely another ghost hunt in an investigation choked with dead ends. The calendar bled out another desolate 8 years. Fast forward to August 2000, marking a dozen years since Michaela's abduction. Law enforcement in Vallejo managed to apprehend a man named Curtis Dean Anderson for the violent kidnapping of 8-year-old Missy Sanchez. By some miracle, the brave little girl managed to break free, and her extraordinary courage directly orchestrated her tormentor's immediate downfall. While in custody, Anderson casually admitted to an even darker atrocity: the 1999 abduction and subsequent slaughter of a 7-year-old victim named Xana Fairchild. Cold case detectives sensed a much wider web of carnage, but lacked the concrete evidentiary fragments necessary to legally bind him to other victims. It wasn't until 2007, with Anderson's liver and kidneys violently failing, that the dynamic shifted. Facing his own mortality, the dying predator sought a final unburdening of his sins. Reaching out to federal agents, he delivered a blood-chilling final testimony. Over the decades, he had successfully hunted and butchered 13 other women and young children. These were phantoms, names the authorities hadn't even linked to a serial killer. Among his confessed conquests was Amber, the 7-year-old taken right before Michaela, the exact tragedy that Binder had so creepily involved himself in. The dying fiend recounted the slaughter with such hyper-specific, unreleased details that federal agents had no choice but to accept his grotesque narrative as fact. Yet again, tangible forensic proof remained completely elusive, and regarding the enduring mystery of Michaela, Anderson staunchly refused credit, insisting her disappearance was the work of another shadow entirely. However, a deeply unsettling coincidence emerged from the files. Anderson operated a vehicle identical to the suspect car reported by a witness, a faded brown 1977 Chevrolet sedan. Archival traffic logs prove that local police had actually executed a traffic stop on him inside that very automobile back in 1989. Naturally, the Bureau desperately needed to squeeze the fading killer for every hidden detail regarding Michaela and the rest of his purported prey, but fate intervened before they ever got the chance. Curtis Dean Anderson took his final breath on December 9, 2007. With his passing, the investigation essentially flatlined. Detectives were left holding nothing but hollow questions, elusive closure, and yet another agonizing dead end. Half a decade quietly slipped by. The calendar turned to 2012, marking 24 agonizing years since that little girl was swallowed by the shadows. Out of the blue, an ex-convict stepped out of the woodwork holding a massive tip. He claimed his old cellmate, the convicted murderer Lauren Herzog, was an absolute dead ringer for Michaela's abductor. This startling revelation immediately sent shockwaves through the department. Herzog, alongside his sinister partner Wesley Shermantine, formed the notorious Speed Freak Killers, a duo locked away for a gruesome string of slayings across California. Detectives quickly pulled Herzog's mugshots from the late 1980s. The chilling resemblance to the original suspect sketch was undeniable. The stringy blonde hair, the distinct bone structure, the perfect age bracket all aligned flawlessly. Yet a massive roadblock loomed ahead. Herzog had taken his own life behind bars in January 2012, merely 4 weeks before this explosive tip ever reached the police. However, the surviving half of the deadly duo, Wesley Shermantine, was breathing and suddenly very talkative. He pointed the finger squarely at Herzog for the snatching and slaughter of the young girl. He dangled a morbid offer, promising to guide authorities to the secret graves of their forgotten prey. law enforcement did not hesitate to accept. Shermantine directed them to an abandoned well in Linden, California, a desolate dumping ground where the twisted pair had discarded bodies. The grim dig commenced immediately. Crime scene technicians painstakingly combed the earth, unearthing thousands of fragmented bones belonging to several different souls. Advanced genetic profiling eventually put names to 5 distinct, tragic victims, all young women and adolescent girls. 5 heartbroken families finally received the grim closure they had desperately sought. Yet, tragically, not a single trace belonged to Michaela Garecht. Authorities tore into other abandoned shafts favored by the murderous pair. They scoured every inch, tested every fragment, but Michaela remained a ghost. Yet another scorching hot lead turned to ash. Detectives were plunged back into darkness. By 2018, 3 grueling decades had evaporated since that fateful day in the parking lot. 3 decades of shattered illusions. 30 years chasing phantoms and dead-end suspects down endless rabbit holes. 30 years of an agonizing purgatory for her loved ones. Sharon Garecht had sacrificed her very existence to the relentless pursuit of her vanished child. Initially, she remained anchored beside a silent telephone. Eventually, she pivoted her desperate crusade to the internet, launching an emotional digital diary titled Dear Michaela. It served as an archive of tear-stained letters directed at a child who might never see them. Sharon bled her soul into every single digital entry. In one particularly gut-wrenching post, she typed, "I feel you out there in the world, my sweet girl. I know you sense my relentless hunt. Please, just come back to me, baby." She eventually rebranded the site Seeker's Road, feeding it for years just to keep that razor-thin lifeline of faith intact. By 2018, however, Sharon was running on fumes, her body shutting down. A devastating terminal cancer diagnosis struck in 2019. The disease was violent and relentless. She could feel the clock winding down, having traded 30 years of unyielding hope for a terrifying absence of truth. Yet, exactly as a mother's physical strength was evaporating, a profound shift was quietly taking shape in the background. A ripple effect was about to shatter the mystery completely. During 2018, Fremont authorities were reopening a dusty file from 1986 concerning a savage double homicide. 2 vibrant young friends, 18-year-old Michelle Xavier and 20-year-old Jennifer Dewey, had been slaughtered shortly after leaving a joyous family celebration. That particular butchery had baffled law enforcement, gathering dust for well over 30 years. However, cutting-edge forensic science was suddenly changing the game entirely. Traces of biological evidence scraped from beneath the victim's nails back in 1986, microscopic clues completely unreadable during that era, were suddenly subjected to state-of-the-art genetic sequencing. The database flashed a terrifyingly perfect match. The microscopic fingerprint pointed directly to a singular, violent phantom, a man named David Emery Mish. Diving deep into his dark history, detectives realized the suspect was already caged. He had been rotting behind bars since the late 80s for the brutal slaying of Margaret Ball. Margaret was merely 36 years old when she was slaughtered in December 1988, a chilling 30 days after Michaela was taken from the world. Her own stepdaughter stumbled upon the horrific scene, discovering her bludgeoned and knifed in a massive crimson lake. The absolute savagery of the assault had sent a front tooth flying feet away. Margaret had actually considered the killer a friend, offering him a lifeline when he was struggling. He rewarded her profound generosity with cold-blooded execution. The courts handed him a sentence of 18 years to life. Slowly succumbing to illness and lockup, he eventually found himself relocated to a state medical prison. Suddenly armed with genetic proof linking him to 2 additional slaughters, detectives placed this aging predator under an intense, unforgiving microscope. Then, one sharp investigator floated the haunting inquiry that would rewrite history. Where exactly was David Mish lurking? Specifically, on November 19, 1988. Authorities frantically tore through his historical files, mapping his precise footprints from that dark era. What they unearthed froze their blood. On that exact date, November 19, 1988, the very afternoon Michaela was snatched into the abyss, this monster was prowling the Hayward district, uncomfortably close to the Rainbow Market. Detectives immediately matched his profile against the terrified friend's initial sketch. A youthful male, perhaps early 20s. This suspect was exactly 27 during the fall of 1988. It was a hauntingly close margin. Greasy blonde locks. The suspect possessed that exact hair tone back then, deeply pitted skin. His vintage arrest photographs displayed heavy facial craters, piercing blue irises. This man's eyes were icy blue, and the vehicle, he drove a battered tan sedan, mirroring the getaway car perfectly. The pieces were finally falling into place, and David Misch mirrored the psychological sketch flawlessly. Yet, mere similarities in a profile would never be sufficient to secure a conviction. Investigators required tangible proof, an indisputable, physical anchor linking him unequivocally to the location of the abduction. That was when a forgotten fragment of history resurfaced in an investigator's memory. The latent print. It was a fractured, heavily degraded smudge lifted from the child's ride, left languishing in archive storage for 32 years simply because the scientific limitations of 1988 rendered it entirely useless. The suspect's biometrics were already logged following his apprehension for the Margaret Ball homicide. What unfolds next is a fascinating war fought between modern forensics and the relentless march of time. Back in 1988, investigative science was comparatively archaic. That 10% fragment of a latent impression held zero value. It was profoundly eroded and missing vital data points. Analysts could decipher the faint loops and whirls, yet the impression lacked the critical mass required to trigger a definitive algorithmic identification. So, the impression remained dormant. It was a silent witness possessing the ultimate truth, yet utterly incapable of whispering a single name. Over 3 decades slowly evaporated, while the scientific landscape underwent a radical transformation. Revolutionary visualization tools and complex digital code emerged, capable of dissecting microscopic traces that previously defied extraction. Armed with these innovations, specialists finally resurrected the dormant files from the vault. Technicians applied cutting-edge graphical refinement to clarify the muddy smudge, deploying highly specialized programming to intricately chart out those previously unreadable microscopic ridges. By running this clarified data against the suspect's logged records through mainframes that were unimaginable 30 years prior, the impossible happened. The system confirmed a flawless connection. The relentless march of innovation had at last overtaken the severe limitations of the past. Following a 32-year silence, that tiny 10% fragment finally found its voice. The microscopic residue pulled from the child's abandoned toy, the literal lure used in the abduction, was unequivocally linked to David Emery Misch. The elusive predator was finally cornered. As winter set in on December 21, 2020, local prosecutors alongside federal agents convened a highly anticipated media briefing. Now sitting at 59 years of age, the accused was officially indicted for the abduction and slaughter of the young girl, while simultaneously staring down the barrel of double homicide charges for 2 women slain in 1986. The briefing room was suffocatingly full. It swelled with journalists, broadcasting teams, locals haunted by the decades-old mystery, and the victim's grieving relatives. The victim's father, now a 71-year-old man, made a grueling journey exceeding 100 miles just to bear witness to this pivotal moment. Though his marriage to his wife had dissolved long ago, a tragic bond kept them tethered together, the desperate, enduring prayer for closure regarding their missing little girl. As the indictment was vocalized, the father's composure completely shattered. Over 32 years of agonizing anticipation, endless speculation, and tortuous optimism had finally culminated. A profound sense of relief washes over me, the grieving father confessed to the gathered press. A heavy burden lifted, knowing a suspect was finally behind bars. "We can only pray he reveals her final resting place," he added. Yet, a glaring absence shadowed the room. The girl's mother was trapped at home, her body entirely ravaged by an aggressive terminal cancer. Confined entirely to her mattress, she was locked in a brutal war just to inhale. In her stead, the commanding law enforcement officer stepped up to deliver her written sentiments. The message was thoroughly soul-crushing. The dying mother confessed that, for an eternity, she had envisioned her sweet child residing safely in paradise. She pictured her lounging upon ethereal mists, strolling down gilded avenues, twirling across emerald pastures, and drifting peacefully across the vast expanse of the universe. The thought of her baby suffering a horrific end was inconceivable. The letter explained how the sudden revelation of an arrest and undeniable forensic proof caused that comforting illusion to violently shatter. And my mind is still struggling to navigate this devastating new truth. For over 3 decades, an agonizing state of ignorance had been her sanctuary, perversely providing the exact conditions necessary for a sliver of optimism to breathe. But with absolute scientific confirmation of her child's brutal demise, that final spark was ruthlessly extinguished. The grieving mother passed away in the spring of 2022. The illness claimed her life long before a courtroom could deliver retribution, entirely depriving her of the knowledge regarding her child's unmarked grave. She never got her final farewell. Yet, she departed this world clutching the certainty that the monster was caged. This begs the chilling question, who exactly was this predator? Entering the world on a winter day in 1961 within the city of Chicago, his descent into darkness was terrifyingly rapid. Before his 17th birthday, he was actively orchestrating brutal offenses. During 1977, as a mere teenager, he invaded a private residence, forced himself upon a domestic worker using a bladed weapon, and subsequently faced swift capture and legal condemnation. The penal system absorbed him, only to foolishly spit him back out onto the streets a mere 12 months later under supervised release. By the winter of 1979, authorities nabbed him again for holding someone against their will and wielding a lethal instrument. Prosecutors quickly escalated the indictment to a sexually motivated, violent attack. Set free in the autumn 1984 brought an indecency charge. By the following August, he offended again. Police caught him cruising Oakland entirely unclothed. A sinister behavioral baseline was forming. He operated as a ruthless, chronic predator, yet the courts continually handed him his freedom. In May 1988, just half a year before the abduction authorities caught him burglarizing a San Leandro market, he received a 12-month sentence and probation. He barely served half that time. By November 1988, he walked free carrying a documented history of violence against women, facing zero barriers to strike again. During that exact same month, November 19, 1988, Michaela Garecht vanished into thin air. By December 1988, he had slaughtered Margaret Ball. The justice apparatus had completely collapsed. Incapable of confining a known monster, it abandoned Margaret to her fate and utterly failed Michaela. After more than 3 decades of shadows and silence, a long overdue reckoning had finally arrived for David Misch. During his initial indictment in 2020, the state sought the ultimate punishment, either execution or life behind bars. The charges were staggering, a trifecta of first-degree homicides paired with a singular, chilling abduction. Yet by 2022, the legal landscape fractured. Alameda County swore in Pamela Price, a newly minted district attorney who would alter the trajectory of the investigation entirely. In a stunning maneuver, Price stripped away every special circumstance attached to the defendant. The implications of this legal pivot were monumental. Should a jury find him guilty of the entire horrifying spree, the threat of lethal injection or dying without the possibility of release was completely off the table. He would merely accumulate more time on top of an already lengthy incarceration. The community erupted into absolute, unbridled outrage over the decision. Mark Kloss, a fierce advocate for missing youth whose own daughter Polly was slain, publicly condemned the move as an unforgivable act of treachery. Chuck Orr, a retired Fremont lieutenant intimately familiar with the 1986 bloodbath, firmly declared that if a human being ever earned the harshest penalty allowable by law, it was this man. Legal scholars observing from the sidelines described the prosecution's strategy as dangerously negligent. Experts pointed out that without a recovered body, the ultimate sentence was their only bargaining chip, a crucial psychological tool to force the killer into giving up the child's hidden grave. It was the definitive textbook scenario for permanently locking away a predator from civilization. Conversely, the defendant's legal counsel, Ernie Castillo, openly celebrated the sudden leniency. From the onset, the defense relentlessly attacked the prosecution's foundation, claiming the belated fingerprint analysis, manifesting after 32 years, was highly suspect. Without human remains, without an admission of guilt, and lacking further forensic ties, Castillo dismissed the entire narrative as nothing more than fraudulent science. The defense suggested authorities were simply making his client a convenient scapegoat, allowing them to neatly tie up several dead-end investigations simultaneously. Meanwhile, the accused remained a stone-cold vault. He refused to speak a single word about the atrocities. He ignored the mounting forensics and absolutely rejected the notion of negotiating any sort of deal. He denied detectives the one crucial detail they craved: the location of the little girl's remains. He cruelly withheld the only piece of closure the grieving family had left. Now, thanks to the district attorney's controversial pivot, this phantom could dodge the ultimate retribution, regardless of a guilty verdict. Yet beneath the sterile arguments of the courtroom lies a trail of shattered lives, forever broken by the dark events of November 19, 1988. Katrina Rodriguez is now a married woman in her middle years residing in Texas, a vast distance from Hayward and the Rainbow Market, yet she remains imprisoned by an overwhelming, suffocating remorse. The very scooter the predator used as bait belonged to her. It was the exact toy she had taken on loan from the victim's sibling. The haunting thought replays in her mind endlessly. It was supposed to be her. Katrina has openly agonized that had she been the one to fetch the toy, the monster would have dragged her into the abyss instead. Perhaps her friend would still be breathing today. That toxic weight of surviving completely eroded any joy left in her youth. To cope, she mentally buried the entire era, erecting psychological walls against the unbearable trauma. In the immediate aftermath of the snatching, the mere thought of facing the grieving mother terrified her. She was convinced she would be met with fierce hatred and accusations. Instead, upon crossing paths, the grieving mother enveloped the trembling girl in an intensely warm embrace. There was not a single ounce of resentment, for the mother possessed a profound clarity. She knew this was merely a 9-year-old child thrust into a nightmare beyond her comprehension. The tragic reality was entirely out of her hands. And then there is Libby, the sibling left behind in the shadow of an empty bedroom. Too young to process the disappearance, she holds no tangible recollections of her older sister. Her mind is filled only with snapshots of her mother sobbing, keeping vigil, and refusing to surrender to the void. In her sister's eyes, the missing girl lacks the breathing essence of quirks and character traits. She exists merely as a faded, two-dimensional portrait. She is a haunting ghost, trapped in time, a child forever locked at age 9 who will never experience adulthood, perpetually doomed to remain an echo. Before taking her final breath, the mother poured her broken heart into the Seeker's Road blog, directing one last desperate message into the ether. I have no way of knowing if my voice penetrates the darkness of wherever you reside. I am unsure if these words can bridge the vast chasm between our worlds, but this must be said. My search for you never ceased. The flame of my hope never extinguished, and my absolute devotion to you never wavered. You were my beautiful miracle, and that truth remains infinite. She took that profound, inescapable agony with her straight into the grave. At the time of this documentation, the 62-year-old predator sits behind bars, waiting for his day in court. Having spent the majority of his existence caged, he is destined to take his final breath in a cell anyway. Yet, there is a distinctly infuriating layer to this entire psychological labyrinth. Detectives squandered the most vital 48 hours of the investigation, hunting a phantom, all due to a catastrophic delay in properly questioning their primary eyewitness. As law enforcement chased a 30-year-old ghost in a crimson vehicle, the actual predator slipped into the shadows inside a beige sedan, carrying away a child who was lost to the world forever. The absolute irony is that investigators possessed the culprit's fingerprint from the very first hour. However, the forensic limitations of 1988 kept it dormant inside a cardboard box for 32 years, quietly waiting for science to evolve. A parade of potential predators was dragged into the spotlight and heavily scrutinized. Every single named suspect turned into a frustrating brick wall, draining precious time and false optimism. Through it all, the true architect of this nightmare was already locked inside the state penitentiary, his biometric data quietly resting in the system. It simply required 3 agonizing decades for forensic algorithms to finally bridge the fatal gap. For more than 30 years, a mother was subjected to an unfathomable hell. An entire bloodline languished in perpetual uncertainty, and a traumatized witness shouldered a crushing, misplaced blame for over 3 decades. Today, even as the walls finally close in on a prime suspect backed by forensics, a chilling veil of mystery continues to smother the truth. Where does the child currently lie? What dark horrors unfolded the moment she was pulled into that vehicle? Was she subjected to prolonged torment, and exactly how many hours did she survive? The answer lies buried within the mind of one man, yet he remains completely impenetrable. In a final, desperate bid for resolution, authorities are currently floating a $10,000 bounty for the coordinates of her hidden grave. Investigators still cling to the quiet hope that somebody out there holds the missing piece. Yet 36 winters have come and gone, and the window for truth narrows with every passing season. What dark lesson remains buried here? First, it stands as a chilling testament to scientific evolution. For 32 agonizing years, a fragmented print sat entirely dormant. Ultimately, advanced digital enhancements pierced through the shadows to force a definitive match. Cold algorithms illuminated what human eyes could not. Second, it serves as a grim indictment of systemic failure. David Misch was a known, ruthless predator who continuously slipped back into society. Time after time, the revolving door of parole granted him leniency, allowing a serial menace to leave an irreparable wake of shattered families. Conversely, it illuminates the unbreakable anchor of maternal devotion. Sharon Garecht absolutely refused to surrender her long-awaited little girl to the unknown. Her entire existence became a singular, agonizing crusade to bring Michaela back. Long after the public lost faith, as years bled into decades and terminal illness ravaged her body, that mother waged an unrelenting war right up to her final heartbeat. Most terrifyingly, this narrative forces us to confront pure malice, proving that true predators easily disguise themselves within ordinary crowds. It shatters the illusion of suburban safety, showing how a vibrant weekend morning can instantly fracture. Two innocent friends chased sugar on their scooters, yet only one survived the journey. Had she not been stolen from the world, Michaela Garecht would be celebrating her 45th birthday today. She was robbed of university days, building a family, and the quiet triumphs of a normal existence. That vibrant potential was completely extinguished, leaving behind only haunting speculations. That is because on November 19, 1988, David Emery Misch violently erased those futures. He dragged a precious blessing into a permanent, waking nightmare. As courtroom proceedings loom closer, a flawed form of legal retribution might finally be delivered. Yet, a singular, devastating truth remains anchored in place. Michaela Garecht is still out there in the void. Her remains are undiscovered, and 36 grueling years later, her loved ones are violently denied a final farewell. Should any fragments of memory regarding her whereabouts linger in your mind, authorities strongly urge you to step out of the shadows and alert the Hayward Police Department. A staggering bounty of $10,000 remains active for any actionable intelligence. As we close this file, we ask that you carry the memory of Michaela Garecht with you. She was far more than a headline. She was a deeply cherished blessing, and she remains lost in the cold unknown, still waiting for someone to finally guide her home.